In this video, we will be building out our get to address endpoint, and it will use the get address data method that we created in the previous video. So our get to address endpoint will be very similar to our block hash endpoint and our transaction ID endpoint. So let's build it out. The first thing that we want to do is we want to store our address in a variable. So we will say const address equals rec.params.address. Cool. The next thing that we want to do is we want to use our getAddressData method to get all of the data for this given address. So in order to do that, we will say bitcoin.getAddressData, and we will pass in our address variable. Now from this method, we get returned to us an object that has the address transactions on it and the address balance on it. So we want to store this data in a variable. So in our endpoint, we will say const address data equals the result of this method. And finally, we just want to send a response back that contains this data. So we will say res.json, and we will send back an object that has an address data property that is equal to our address data variable right here. And that's it. That's all we need to do to build out our address endpoint. So let's save this file, and now let's test this endpoint to make sure that it works properly. So in order to test this endpoint, let's head over to our browser, and let's get the blockchain that's on 3001. Cool. So now all we have to do is add a couple of transactions and a couple of blocks to this blockchain. So let's add some transactions inside of Postman. So when creating these transactions, we want to make sure that we keep track of a specific address so that we can check it when we hit our address endpoint. So in order to keep track of a specific address, I'm just going to change the first 3 letters of this address to the name Jen. That way we can keep track of this address. Cool. So let's make some transactions. For one transaction, we'll send 100 Bitcoin, and we will make Jen the sender of this transaction. So let's send it now. Cool. Now let's make another transaction in which Jen is the recipient. And let's change this address a little bit to this string right here. It can be really whatever you want it to be for the purpose of our testing right now. Cool. And let's send this transaction with a value of 200 Bitcoin. And send it now. Cool. Now let's mine a block to add these transactions to our blockchain. So we will hit localhost 3001/mine. Cool. So this block was mined successfully. Let's make a couple more transactions. So let's now make a transaction worth 500 Bitcoin, and we'll send it to Jen. Let's make another transaction worth 1,000 Bitcoin and send it to Jen. And now let's mine another block. So we will refresh this endpoint. And our new block has been mined. That's good, and it has our transactions inside of it. And let's make another transaction in which Jen is the recipient of 2,000 Bitcoin. And let's make one more transaction in which Jen is the sender of 300 Bitcoin. So we will take Jen's address and put it as the sender, and then we'll change this to be some other string here. Cool. And let's send this. And let's mine this final block now. Cool. So now all of the transactions that we just created should be inside of our blockchain. Let's see. Cool. So we now have a bunch of blocks inside of our blockchain, and all of the transactions that we created are here inside of the blockchain. Perfect. Now, in order to test that our address endpoint works, we want to head over to the browser in a new tab, and we want to hit the endpoint localhost 3001 /address, and then /, and now we want to copy Jen's address to see what her balance is and what her address data is. So we'll copy this address and we'll paste it right here. Now, from all of the transactions that we created in Postman, if you kept track of when Jen was the sender and when she was the recipient, at this point, Jen should have a balance of 3,300 Bitcoin. Let's check to make sure that's true. So we'll hit this endpoint right now. Cool. So this is the address data property that we get back, and on it we have all of the address transactions that are associated with this Jen address, which is pretty cool. We have all of the transactions in which Jen is the sender and in which Jen is the recipient. And then we also have this address balance property. And the balance of this address is 3,300 Bitcoin, which is just what we expect it to be. Perfect. Cool, so we got all the correct data back for this address. Let's try another address now. One other address that we can try is our node address, which is the address of this node that we have been mining all of our blocks on. So this node address should have received all of the block mining rewards. So we can check this by heading over to our browser and going to one of our mining reward transactions. So over here we can see that this is a mining reward transaction because the sender is the address 00. So from this we can tell that this recipient address is the address of the node that we have been mining all of these blocks on. So let's check the balance of our node address. So we'll copy this address and we'll put it right here and press enter. Cool. So you can see that the balance of our node address is 37.5 Bitcoin. And that comes from the 3 blocks that our node mined and the rewards that come from mining those blocks. Pretty cool. Now, as one final example, let's pass in an address that doesn't exist. And we get the data that there are no address transactions associated with this address, which makes sense. It's a fake address. And the balance of this address is 0. Perfect. So our address endpoint is working just as it should. In the next couple of videos, we will use all 3 of these endpoints that we just built out inside of our Block Explorer, which will be pretty cool. So I'll see you in the next video.